And away we go. I'm Kaylem Shepherd. This is the Memo, our political hub, where we come together and discuss pressing political stories. First of all, I want to start with the state of our political system. And the question is, where do we start? Brexit has ruined our country. Let's be honest. It really has. Our education system is a two-tier system. The price of train fares is ludicrous. Have you seen the increase in prices in the grocery stores? And let's not even talk about trying to drink tap water. It's contaminated. There we go. Our country is broken. Whose fault is it? Oh, I don't know. And that's why I'm joined by my friend, Albie Amankona, to discuss. Albie, thank you very much for joining me on the podcast.
Hello,
Appreciate
Kaylem.
it.
I'm happy to be here.
I'm happy to have you here. It's nice
What
to
a
see
monologue.
you. And what a monologue.
Very animated.
Oh, you are too kind.
You're furious, aren't you?
I am angry. And I'm angry with the Tories.
Yes.
Because they've ruined our country, have they not?
On what metric?
The education system is broken. Our NHS is broken.
Well, I think what you've got to understand, I'm not going to apologise. I'm sorry, I'm not going to be an apologist for the errors that the last Conservative government made. But I think particularly in education, with the introduction of things like free schools, allowing schools more independence, we've actually seen education standards in this country in terms of English pupils' literacy and numeracy rates become some of the best in the world because of some of the education reforms that Michael Gove introduced that were quite unpopular at the time, but it is undeniable that they have led to better educational outcomes. So I think education is actually one of the areas that the Tories can look at over the last 14 years and think that is something we can be proud of. Now, the situation with the infrastructure, the rack problem with some of the actual buildings crumbling, that is a problem.
In our schools?
That is a problem. But in terms of the quality of education that British children are getting, some people might argue that it's actually, in the state sector, never been better. On the NHS,
all the teachers not being able to teach our students with classes full of, 30 plus, I don't find that quite...
If you look at the results that children are getting when they leave school, they are better after 14 years of Conservative government than they were before. And I think that is quite a decent metric with which to base my points. Now, on the issue about NHS spending and NHS outcomes, yeah, the NHS has become worse over the last 14 years. But also the NHS budget has increased by almost 50%.
So do you think it's mismanagement within the NHS rather than
I
government?
think that's part of it. But I think a lot of the debate we're having today is about, the NHS needs more money. A lot of politicians talk about it in terms of the NHS needs more money. What person increases the budget of an organisation by 50%, sees that organisation gets worse outcomes after you've increased the budget by 50% and think, oh, do you know what I want to do? I want to do that again. We can't carry on doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different outcome. That's the definition of insanity.
So this podcast is obviously focused on young people getting, involved in politics, wanting to get involved in politics. There's no way young people are getting involved in politics nowadays. It's too hard. Most, young people say they feel like politicians don't even stand for them. Would you agree?
I understand why young people feel so annoyed at the moment. I don't even know if I really count as a young person when I'm sitting in front of you.
You're quite young.
I'm 30 and you're in your early 20s, so you're, a young person, and perhaps I'm like a young person in political terms. I just use an inverted comma speech mark, hand signals for those of you who are listening to this podcast. It's an area which I think politicians need to pay a lot more attention to. If we look at what has happened since the 2008 financial crash, we've essentially seen productivity levels and wage levels essentially stagnate. We have seen an economic challenge, which has meant economic growth has not recovered to the level that it did pre the 2008 financial crash. And we've now got a whole generation of young people who are becoming adults in a world where they do not have access to the things that their parents had. Whether or not that is purely on an economic basis, things like housing, being able to afford to buy your own home or even rent somewhere, things like job stability. Lots of people that are our parent generation might have had the same job for 30 years, that the employment situation now is a lot more precarious. There are also lots of other benefits that older generations got, things like free education. Also, young people have been almost brought up to be fearful of the future because of some of the rhetoric.
Are you fearful of the future?
No, I'm actually an optimist. I do think the antidote to this is by understanding that actually the future will be better than it is now, but we have to make that decision as
Well, according to polling, young people are scared of their future.
I understand, but this is why I'm not optimist about it. The future
the
will
Tories could be to blame for scaring young people.
The future will be shit if we...
How can I buy a house?
The future will be shit if we accept that things are going to get worse, because at the end of the day, people like you and me and our listeners, Kaylem, are going to have to be the people in charge who are going to make the difference. Our parents' generation did a rubbish job of it. I think the generation in between us haven't done a very good job of it. That means we have to make things better.
So who's to blame for all of this?
It is consecutive governments.
David Cameron?
Over the last 30 years, going all the way...
Theresa May?
Going all the way from Blair, perhaps even Thatcher
Boris Johnson.
until now. Well, every Prime Minister from perhaps Thatcher until now is to blame for the situation that the United Kingdom is in. So that would include all 5 of the last Tory Prime Ministers, a ridiculous number of Prime Ministers in 14 years. The Labour Prime Ministers, there were 2 of them. And then you might even argue some of Major and some of Thatcher as well.
Do you think Keir Starmer is the hope that this country needs?
No.
Why not?
Have you been watching the news since he was in power?
I have been watching the news, and he's had some... Well, it's not for me to give my opinion, but where were the Tories going to go? Were they just going to get a new leader and reform themselves as they always do? They reformed themselves several times. What changed between David Cameron and Rishi Sunak?
I think a lot changed between David Cameron and Rishi Sunak. Obviously, Brexit happened, and in
Was that a good thing for our
2016
country?
there was the referendum. Look, it was a
shambles.
It was the biggest democratic vote in the history of the United Kingdom, and I think people should not be too flippant when it comes to talking about Brexit. Now, I don't think any Brexiteer would argue Brexit has been a success. On the things that Brexit was supposed to deliver, I don't think there's any metric that you can possibly measure Brexit on and say it has been successful at reducing migration. Migration is now higher than it was before Brexit because of the liberalisation of immigration that Priti Patel, Boris Johnson and Suella Braverman did.
But that was one of their key points, to lower immigration.
It was, and it's not happened.
Why not? Because that was the base of the whole Brexit debate. So you can understand why some people are like, what was the whole point of this? Have I been lied to?
It was part of it. It was definitely part of it.
Do you feel like you've been lied to?
I don't necessarily feel like I was personally lied to.
So what has Brexit achieved?
It has...
That you're positive about?
What a Brexiteer would say would be that it has achieved sovereignty for the United Kingdom, and that means Britain and Britain alone can decide which direction it goes on without having the shackles of the EU attached to it. And they would also argue that Britain has chosen to go in the wrong direction after Brexit. I just find the arguments personally about sovereignty, although I appreciate sovereignty is important, I don't think people voted for Brexit because they thought, oh, sovereignty, that's something that passionate Brexiteers care about. I think a lot of people voted for Brexit because they thought things were going to improve after Brexit. Actually, things have gotten worse.
Only get better.
And I don't think things have got worse because of Brexit, actually. I think the amount of impact Brexit has, the European Union has on the economic trajectory of the UK was both over-egged by the Leave campaign and the Remain campaign. They were both saying, the Leave campaign was saying things are going to be great if we stay in. Sorry, the Leave campaign was saying things are going to be great if we leave. The Remain campaign was saying it's going to be great if we stay in. Well, actually, if you look at European countries after Brexit, let's take Germany, which is at the heart of the EU, and the UK, which has left the EU, in terms of where those countries are on the question of economics and the question of immigration, they're in almost exactly the same place. So I think saying that the EU was the be-all and end-all of how the British country will improve... how the British country will improve or not was a total red herring. And that's why I say I think the argument is a bit of a waste of time now.
I think it goes deeper than that, though. It was a campaign full of lies, mistruths, and people voted on those lies and those mistruths. So can you understand why people feel like Brexit was this, sham, this mockery?
I honestly don't think it is important because of the reasons that I just mentioned.
Do you think we should go back to the EU?
I think we have left the European Union.
If Starmer said we're going to go back, would you vote to?
I would say we need to move on and focus on different things. Because as I mentioned before, countries inside the EU and countries outside the EU that are of a similar size and of a similar economic situation are in exactly the same position.
But what about all those young people who, I love traveling through Europe. I'm sure most of my friends do. I'm sure you do too. It's really the young who are affected by Brexit. And most of them didn't vote for Brexit.
I would again say that there are more pressing issues that the UK
No, but this is a
government...
pressing issue.
No, actually...
Because this is affecting our future.
No, it's not. The issues that are pressing are the things that we discussed earlier on. Things like housing, things like employment stability, things like encouraging people to have more children. We heard a statistic today saying that the fertility rate in the UK is the lowest that it's ever been. That means this country might start experiencing things like depopulation, like we're seeing in Japan and like we're seeing in South Korea. We're young people. We need to solve the problems of the future, not have the arguments of yesterday. And I think the Brexit debate is a waste of time.
So what do you think the biggest thing young people are worried about in the future? Housing?
I can only speak for myself.
What are you worried about?
Based on how I feel and also the concerns that I hear about from other people. I'm involved in a lot of young political groups, a group called the Next Generation Tories, for example. And I think certainly the number one issue that comes up for people around my age, and I'm perhaps 10 years older than you, but maybe people in their late 20s, early 30s, is definitely around the housing issue.
I mean, a house in, for example, southwest London is nearing on £700,000. How does a young professional afford that by themselves?
They can't, and that's the problem. And so I think housing is an issue that comes up a lot. It's something that people feel very passionately about. And then I think a lot of things lead on from housing, because if you have a stable home, you can settle down. If you have a stable home, you can have children. If you have an affordable home, it means you've got more disposable income to spend money on the things that you want to spend money on and have a nicer life. So much is connected to housing. If you can buy a house near your family, you're probably going to be happier. And it means that perhaps you've got grandparents to help with childcare when you do have children. All of these different things that are tied to the home and communities. Yeah. We seem to have lost that. And I think that is something which young people are definitely concerned about. I also think defence is something which we don't actually talk about enough. Maybe it's not something which is necessarily on young people's radar because we haven't really...
I mean, well, look at the wars going on at the moment.
Well, precisely, but we haven't really grown up in a time where conflict was happening in Europe.
Yeah, of course.
Whereas I talked to my mum about when she grew up and the Cold War was happening, and they honestly thought maybe a nuclear bomb was going to get dropped on them at some point. Yeah. We've never had that, so we don't really understand why defence is so important and why defence spending is so important. Of course, the generation before that, my grandmother grew up during the war. Yeah. So we've got these two generations that live with this very real threat, one of hot war, one of cold war, and our generation, which hasn't really experienced any of that. So I think there's been a bit of a amnesia about it. And I think the chickens have come home to roost with what we're seeing happening in Israel and Gaza, and also in Russia and Ukraine, and potentially Taiwan and China.
Do you think the UK should stop funding the war in Ukraine?
No, I don't think the UK should stop supporting the war in Ukraine. The UK should not stop supporting the war in Ukraine. We do have to have a conversation about how we bring about an end to this war, what that might look like. Are there any compromises that may need to be made on both sides?
We don't want to poke the bear.
We don't want to poke the bear, but then we've also got to understand Russia's poking the bear quite a lot, conscripting troops from North Korea.
That was wild.
I mean, it's just ridiculous. And we're not even allowing Ukraine to use missile systems when literally North Korean soldiers are fighting on behalf of Russia and Ukraine. We don't even want. We're so worried about it. We don't even want to give them some targeted missile systems.
Yeah.
I think the West needs to man up a bit and actually be like, you know what? I think we can probably provide these missile systems.
Would you take up arms if they asked you to?
In what sense?
To fight for Ukraine?
For Ukraine?
Yeah.
No, I don't know why you would expect a British person to fight for Ukraine.
Just asking.
Would you?
I mean, I think that's a good, good question. I don't think many young people feel like it's their job or their duty to, protect the Western
But if the
world.
UK was under attack in the same way that Ukraine is under attack,
Well,
I think I would absolutely fight. Yeah.
Not sure I could say I'll do the same.
Well, I think that is an issue, but I think that comes back to the things that we were discussing earlier on, in that young people don't really feel valued in this country because of the situation that we are inheriting from people who have made things like this. We don't have a stake in society. If you don't have a stake in society through owning a home or having a stable job or whatever, if you don't have a stake in society, you don't really have anything to lose. So you might feel that you were less connected to the country that you grew up in, just because of the economic situation that you're in. And we need to change that.
So just FYI for all the listeners and people watching the podcast, we're filming this on a Tuesday before the budget comes out, which is meant to come out on Wednesday. Apparently businesses are going to be screwed over. Just another blow again for businesses. Why would anybody want to start a business now?
I think that's a good question. It depends what we are thinking of here. Now, look, I could come at it from a conservative perspective and say I think the budget is going to be awful and this is what we should be doing instead. But I'm not going to do that because I don't necessarily think that is helpful. This country's got a huge problem what we're going to have to solve in our lifetimes. We've got an aging population and a shrinking labour force, which means that over a period of time, as the working age population gets smaller and the out of work pensioner population gets larger, working age people will be taxed more and more in order to fund the elderly population which is out of work and all of the services that they need. And so we can have this conversation about, the government should be spending more money on this or should we be lowering taxes? And really, if we look over a 50-year horizon, these micro conversations that we're having about tax and spend now are a complete waste of time. Because ultimately, on the trajectory that we're on, with economic growth and productivity essentially flat, tax take essentially flat, government spending increasing over time, we will start to see the amount of money spent on everything but work and pensions and also health, maybe defence, non-protected departments, shrink over time because the demands on the state will get bigger from this ever-growing elderly population that is not in work. That's a big problem. We've got to solve that problem. And that's going to require more than talking about a budget. What I'd like to hear in the budget is an acknowledgement of this problem. It's not something that many politicians are talking about, and I think it's the biggest issue facing the country today. The future budgets that we have will look like the budget we are about to see tomorrow in perpetuity if we don't fix this problem. That's the reality of the situation.
Yeah.
And more people need to be talking about it.
Do you think Labour are the party of the working class anymore? Are they the party of the ordinary, mum, dad?
Well, they were
kids?
this time. They were this time, weren't they? They did win the last general election. But I think there are a lot of people, a lot of families across the country that voted for Labour in the most recent general election and will think, what have I done? I mean, I've already spoken to so many Labour voters who've said, well, actually, I think Rishi Sunak was better.
Yeah.
I mean, I would say I think Rishi Sunak was better. I didn't think he was particularly good, but I think he's better. He was better than Keir Starmer. And who would have thought things would be going so badly?
It's a really tough time. It's a bad time for young people. I mean, there's an article out saying, do Labour represent young people anymore? And some people argue they don't. and that's why they're moving to people like Nigel Farage. What do you say to a young, voter who doesn't know where to go and thinks, well, the Tories have really fucked our country up. Labour, are trying to smoking bans on pubs. They're, stripping the elderly of their winter fuel allowance. They're not helping me anymore with university. Why can't I go to Nigel Farage? He seems fun. He seems optimistic. What would you say to that person?
I would say to any person that was coming up with their political beliefs, you will have a sense of who you are and yourself. Don't just go off the last manifesto of a political party or what people are kind of saying in media and people that you like the sound of. Understand your values, understand what you believe in, read about the parties, and I don't just mean read their last manifesto, read about the history of the parties, read about some of the people that have led the parties. You will have a natural affinity to whichever party it is that I think you should vote for and join and campaign for and get involved in. But I would just encourage people really to look into things, because there'll be things that you like and dislike about all political parties. There are things I like about Nigel Farage. There are things I really dislike about
What do you like about Nigel Farage?
Well, I used to work with him at GB News. He's a very charismatic, charming, friendly character. Worked with him a number of times. Everyone gets on with him. I even think my mum, who absolutely hates all of his politics, would get on with him. He's a very likable person. I think there's a lot of people could learn from him. I think he's an excellent broadcaster. He used to be at LBC. He's now at GB News. He reads things without script quite often. I don't think you can say, even if you disagree with the impact that Nigel Farage has had, that what he's done in his political career has been probably the most impactful and impressive politician, if we're just talking about it on a technical basis, of the 21st century. I think that
division?
I think that is indisputable.
The amount of division this man has caused,
on a technical level, when I say technical, I mean if we think about the outcomes that he's had, the UK leaving the European Union, a much more Eurosceptic environment, which is more sceptical of globalization, more sceptical of immigration. That is all Nigel Farage, really. And whether that's for good or bad on a technical level, in terms of who has had the biggest impact.
Do you think he's a racist?
No, I don't think Nigel is racist. I don't think Nigel is racist. I don't think he takes racism seriously enough within the Reform Party, and he needs to think about why it is that his movements seem to attract racists, which they do. I've had arguments with people from the Reform Party live on air about this very issue. I don't know what it is about that movement, but it attacks racists, and they need to figure out why that is and become less attractive to racists if they want to replace the Conservative Party. But I don't think they're going to do that.
Throughout this episode, we've been talking about the future. I think you are the future. I do see you being a Conservative MP somewhere. Is that something you'd be interested in? And if so, why?
I think I might think about standing one day. It's something I've always, I think when you're in this kind of political world that I occupy, doing a lot of media stuff, you sort of think, oh, you will see a lot of people, and you might think, lots of people might think, oh, I could do that. We're on the same panels. This person that I'm talking to, I don't think is that different to me. What makes them better than me? I think if you're in that environment, you do think maybe I could do this. Equally, there are a lot of downsides to being an MP nowadays that there weren't necessarily in the past. We had 2 MPs assassinated in recent history. Earlier on this year, an MP that I know, their office got burnt down in an attempted assassination. It's really awful to be an MP at the moment. So I think whilst I have always thought about it, there are pros and there are cons, as with everything. But I think the cons are getting a lot bigger now.
The Conservative Party race is on. It's either going to be Kemi or it's going to be Robert Jenrick. I know that you support Kemi.
Yes.
What advice would you give to her if she becomes the Conservative leader?
I would say Kemi is a very different person in real life than how she comes across in media. In some media, rather.
I mean, she comes across quite nasty, I think.
Well,
quite divisive.
I think that's part of it. I don't think that is. I don't think that's
Is that the
all,
real? Is that the real?
I
Kaylem?
don't think that's all she comes across as. But there are certainly times where she has made mistakes in the media, and I have told her that to her face. And I do think she is improving. I think if I look at the latest set of interviews that I've seen recently, she did one with Sophie Ridge on Sky News. She's done one with Times Radio. Some of the more recent interviews she's done, I think, are a lot better than the earlier interviews that she did. But she's a work in progress politician. Both of the two leadership candidates that we have, they're not polished diamonds just yet. They're still quite young. They still have work to do to improve. But I think Kemi is best placed to lead the Conservative Party. I think she's got the principles. I think she's got the conviction. I think she's got the competence. She held quite senior positions in the last Conservative government. And for whatever reason, she has cut through to the general public. You might like what she says, you might hate what she says, but you always hear what she says.
And why don't you support Robert Jenrick?
It was really difficult for me to pick between Robert and Kemi. I think Robert in particular actually has been the most impressive supporter for the young group of Conservatives called the Next Generation Tories. Works on a lot of things to do with housing, reducing living costs for younger people, cutting taxes for working people. He really gets the whole issue of attracting young people, I think, more than anyone in Parliament, actually. But for me, he is too focused on leaving the ECHR. I do not think that is a priority at the moment. My concern with the ECHR is a similar thing that happened with the Brexit will happen with the ECHR. We'll spend all of this time leaving and nothing will change.
Do you think we should leave the ECHR?
Only if we need to. But
that's not an answer.
But only if we need to. That is my answer.
No, that's not an answer.
It is an answer because I do not think right now a priority is leaving another international institution and promising all these things are going to happen.
Okay, do you think it's a good institution?
Like we did last time. Broadly speaking, do I think it's a good institution? Yes, I think it's a good institution. Do I think the scope of it has changed and perhaps it's not fit for purpose anymore because we can't do things like the Rwanda plan. We can't deport certain.
Well, let's not get started.
We can't deport certain foreign criminals because of ECHR rulings. A lot of things that British people would think are outrageous. Yeah, there are problems with the ECHR, but we don't have to pretend things are perfect. But also,
nothing's perfect.
Also, we should not pretend that leaving the ECHR wouldn't create other problems. And I suppose what I'm asking people to ponder is, are the problems that leaving the ECHR would create bigger than the current problems that we have? We'd have to renegotiate the Good Friday Agreement. We'd have to renegotiate the EU-UK trade agreement. The EU-UK trade agreement, that took ages to negotiate. And the last Tory government basically didn't do anything but negotiate that deal. And what has come from it? The Good Friday Agreement was before you and I were born. The IRA, they used to bomb shopping centres when my mum was growing up in Manchester. Like, the Good Friday Agreement ended the IRA. Like, do we really want to go back to a period in time where we're working through all of these things? So, I come back to the point that I made earlier on about us, people who are younger in our generation, perhaps having this amnesia of the past. I think we've forgotten about how bad things were when the IRA was at large. You know, bombing Margaret Thatcher in Brighton. All of these crazy things that we were just thinking nuts.
Yeah.
Now, like, the Good Friday Agreement ended that. Do we really want to put peace in Northern Ireland at risk? I don't think it would be as bad as it was when the IRA was at large, but it certainly wouldn't make things better, would it?
No. With that, Albie, so sorry, but we're out of time. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. Really appreciate it. Everybody, Albie Amankona, broadcaster, financial analyst, and all-round nice guy. Appreciate your time.
Thank you, Kaylem.
I'm Kaylem Shepherd. This is the Memo podcast. Subscribe for some provocative and juicy content.